Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. And before we dive into the story, my mom said we can't get to 1,000 subscribers. Can you help me prove her wrong? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and be part of this journey. Let's show her what we can do. Now, let's dive into the story. The first thing people noticed about the stranger was how little he carried. He came down the long red dirt road into Asheville, New Mexico on a Tuesday in late October, when the sky was the color of old bone and the wind moved through the dead grass like a whisper no one wanted to hear. He rode a brown and gray mottled horse that walked slowly, as if it had long ago stopped being in a hurry for anything. The man himself wore a canvas coat the color of dust, a brim-battered hat pulled low, and boots held together by what looked like stubbornness alone. He had no saddlebags worth mentioning, no rifle, no bedroll. A canteen hung against the horse's flank with a hollow, empty sound. The people of Asheville stood on their boardwalks and watched him come. Old women stopped sweeping. A blacksmith set down his hammer. Two boys playing near the water trough went quiet and just stared. Nobody waved. Nobody called out a greeting. Asheville hadn't been the kind of town that welcomed strangers for a long time. Not since Silas Drum had bought up half the county and started deciding who mattered and who didn't. He tied his horse to the post outside Drum's mercantile and stepped down onto the street with the careful movement of a man whose bones had been broken at least once and had healed slightly wrong. He straightened up, took off his hat and ran one hand through dark hair shot through with threads of gray, though he couldn't have. He'd been older than 40. His face was lean and hard, like land that hadn't seen rain in 2 seasons. But his eyes were something different. They were still and dark and patient. The kind of eyes that had decided something a long time ago and were simply waiting for the world to catch up. He looked at the mercantile sign, Drums painted in tall black letters. He looked at the bank across the road, Drums First Savings. He looked at the hotel, the land office, the feed store, most of them wearing Drum's name like a flag planted in conquered territory. A slow breath moved through him. Not anger, not grief. Something quieter and more dangerous than both. He put his hat back on and walked toward the saloon. He was 2 steps from the saloon door when it happened. Deputy Orrin Feck stepped out from the alley between the barber shop and the post office, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, with the particular walk of a man who had never once been told no. Feck was wide through the chest, with a jaw like a cabinet door and small pale eyes that missed very little. He stopped directly in the stranger's path. Behind him, 2 of Drum's ranch hands materialized from the saloon. Tuck Garver and a big-shouldered boy everyone just called Bones. "You planning on stopping here?" Feck said. His voice was flat and not remotely curious. The stranger stopped walking. He didn't reach for anything. Didn't tense visibly. He just looked at Feck the way you might look at weather, noting it, not afraid of it. "Just a drink," the stranger said. His voice was low and unhurried, a voice that had learned not to spend itself on anything unnecessary. Feck looked him up and down slowly. The way a dog examines something, it's deciding whether to bite. "Saloons for residents of Asheville and their guests," he said, "not for drifters." What happened next became the thing people talked about for weeks. Not because of any violence, but because of the stillness. The stranger reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Feck's hand dropped toward his gun. The ranch hand stepped forward, but the stranger's hand came out, holding nothing but a folded piece of paper. He opened it slowly and held it up so the watching townspeople could see what it was. A land deed, an Ashevale land deed, with the territory seal in its corner. He didn't explain it. He simply let Feck look at it for a long moment, then folded it back up and returned it to his coat. "My name is Caden Holt," he said. "I used to own 380 acres south of this town. I built the irrigation channels that still water your fields. I dug the well behind the schoolhouse. I paid Silas Drum's bank $2,000 in 1879. He paused. "I'm not a drifter. I'm the man this whole town forgot it owed something to." The silence that fell on Ashevale's main street was so complete. You could hear the wind pushing dust between the buildings. Feck's face did something complicated. His mouth opened, then closed. The ranch hands exchanged a look. From somewhere behind the windows of Drum's first savings building, a curtain shifted and fell back into place. Caden Holt didn't wait for a response. He stepped around Feck with the calm of a man who had rehearsed this moment 10,000 times in lonely rooms and cold nights on the open trail. He pushed through the saloon doors and let them swing shut behind him. Inside, the barman, a thin-necked man named Giff with tobacco-stained fingers, looked up and then immediately backed down at the glass he was polishing. Two card players paused their game. A woman at the far end of the bar, wearing a dress with red fabric roses at the collar, watched Caden with eyes that recognized something, though she said nothing yet. Caden sat down on a stool, set his hat on the bar beside him, and asked for water. Not whiskey, not beer. Water. Giff brought it without a word. Caden drank slowly, staring at the cracked mirror behind the bar. In its reflection, his eyes looked like two lit coals at the bottom of a dark well. He had ridden into Ashevale with nothing. What nobody in that town understood yet was that nothing had been the plan all along. To understand what Caden Holt had come back for, you had to understand what Ashevale had looked like before Silas Drum arrived. In 1876, it was a small, dry, struggling town of maybe 200 souls sitting at the edge of the Jornado Basin with cracked earth and sun-baked buildings and not nearly enough water to grow the crops that might make it permanent. Families were already leaving. The general store had closed twice. The church had no pastor because no pastor would ride out to a town that looked like it was already dying. Then a 29-year-old land surveyor named Caden Holt rode in from the east with a mule, a set of engineering instruments, and a plan that everybody said was impossible. He was lean then, clean-shaved, with quick, dark eyes and a way of looking at land that made you feel like the land itself was answering questions you hadn't thought to ask. He looked at the basin topography for 3 days, then sat down with the mayor and drew lines on a map that showed exactly where to dig channels so that the water from the hill springs 2 miles north would flow down and irrigate the fields south of town. "It'll work," he said. Nobody believed him. He did it anyway. It took 2 years. He dug the first trench with his own hands before anyone else joined in. He borrowed tools, traded surveying work for labor, and slept in the field more nights than he slept in a bed. By 1878, the channels were running. Ashevale's fields were green for the first time in living memory. Crops grew, families stayed, new ones arrived. A doctor came, a school was built. The general store reopened and stayed open. The church got a pastor. And through all of it, Caden Holt was the man people nodded to when they walked past him on the street, not with awe, not with ceremony, just with the quiet, solid recognition that this was a man who had done something real. He had also, by that point, purchased 380 acres of land south of town from a family leaving for California, paying for it in installments over 3 years. He built a small house on it, planted a vegetable garden, and married a woman named Lena Voss, who had come to Asheville as a schoolteacher and had the kind of calm, clear intelligence that made Caden feel, for the first time in his adult life, like he was building something that would last. Lena Voss was 31 years old when she married Caden Holt, and she was the kind of woman that towns remember longer than they remember most men. She was not soft. She'd grown up poor in Missouri and had worked for every year of her education with a stubbornness that made Caden's own determination look casual by comparison. She ran the schoolhouse with a firm hand and genuine warmth. And on evenings, she and Caden would sit on the porch of their small house while the irrigation channels whispered below them in the dark and the stars came out over New Mexico in their extraordinary numbers. She used to say that the stars out there made her feel rich, that no matter how little money they had, no one could take away a sky like that. Caden used to laugh at that, a real laugh, easy and unguarded in a way that nobody in Asheville ever heard from him in later years. They were happy. Not the dramatic happiness of stories, but the deep, quietly extraordinary happiness of two people who have found each other and know it. That was the thing about what Drum later did to Caden. He didn't just steal land. He stole the last place where that happiness had lived. Silas Drum arrived in Asheville in the spring of 1879, riding in on a fine gray horse with 2 associates and a leather satchel full of investment capital. He was 35, well-dressed in a way that seemed deliberately restrained. Good fabric, not flashy. He had a handshake like a promise and eyes that were warm and attentive in conversation while calculating something else entirely behind them. He said he wanted to invest in the town, build a proper bank, bring in capital from the east. The mayor was charmed. Half the town council was charmed. Caden was not charmed, but he was polite. Drum shook Caden's hand, told him the irrigation work was the most impressive thing he'd seen west of the Mississippi, and invited him to deposit his savings in the new Drum's first savings bank that was opening the following month. Caden deposited $2,000, every dollar he had saved since before the land purchase. In good faith, as a gesture of civic participation, he had no reason not to. The man had smiled at him in his kitchen and complimented Lena's coffee. There was nothing yet to be afraid of. But Silas Drum had been watching Asheville for 2 years before he arrived. Caden's land and Caden's irrigation system were the first things on his list. Then, in October of 1879, Lena Holt got sick. It came on fast, the way the worst things do, a fever that didn't break, a cough that went too deep, a pallor that showed up overnight and refused to leave. There was a doctor in Asheville by then, an older man named Price who had come from St. Louis, and he did what he could. He was honest about what he couldn't. "Consumption," he said quietly to Caden one evening in the hallway outside their bedroom door. Caden stood in that hallway for a long time after Price left, one hand flat against the wall, not moving. Inside the room, Lena was sleeping. He could hear her breathing, careful and deliberate, as if even in sleep she was being precise about each breath. Caden Holt, who had moved mountains of earth with his bare hands to make water run uphill through sheer force of will, had absolutely nothing to do against what was happening inside that room. He went in and sat beside her bed and held her hand, and that was all he had. He didn't know yet that while he was sitting in that room watching his wife breathe, Silas Drum was already having documents drawn up. Lena Holt died on a Thursday morning in November 1879. When the cottonwood trees along the irrigation channels had gone bare, and the sky was flat and gray and indifferent to everything. She died with Caden's hand in hers, and whatever she said to him at the end, he never repeated it to a single person in his life. The funeral was attended by most of Asheville. She had taught half the children in town, and the parents of those children stood at the graveside in their best clothes with their faces doing the complicated work of grief for a woman who had deserved far better than to die young in a dry town, at the edge of nowhere. Caden stood at the head of the grave, in a black coat that didn't quite fit him, and watched them lower her into the ground. He didn't cry. Not because he didn't feel it, but because what he felt was something beyond the reach of crying. A vast, structural silence that had opened up inside his chest, like a well someone had dug straight down to the center of the earth. He thanked people for coming. He shook hands. He rode home alone through the brown November fields and sat down at the kitchen table in his coat and didn't move for a very long time. For 6 weeks after Lena died, Caden Holt was not himself. This was not dramatic collapse. He didn't break furniture or scream at the sky. It was quieter and harder than that. He stopped eating regular meals. He stopped maintaining the house. He took to riding out alone in the early morning hours when the desert was still dark and cold, riding nowhere in particular and coming back hours later with dust on his coat and eyes that seemed to be looking at something very far away. He drank more than he should have. Not constantly, not falling down drunk, but enough to blur the evenings and make the nights shorter than they actually were. He went into town less, and when he was in town, he wasn't quite present in the way he used to be. That quick, engaged attention of his had gone somewhere, and what was left in its place was a kind of courteous blankness that made people uncomfortable without being able to say exactly why. His neighbors checked in on him. He thanked them. He didn't improve. And it was precisely during this 6-week window of grief and disconnection that Silas Drum moved. Drum came to the house on a gray December afternoon with his accountant, a small, nervous man named Milo Bassett, who wore spectacles and carried a leather document case and never quite met anyone's eyes. Drum sat across from Caden at the kitchen table and spoke in a low, concerned voice about the mortgage arrangements on the land, arrangements that Caden was confident he was current on. He said there was a complication with the filing of the original deed, something about the territorial land registry, and that he'd had his people draw up a simple clarification document that would keep everything secure. Caden should have read it carefully. Anyone not fogged with grief would have read it carefully. But Caden was barely sleeping, barely eating, and his mind was in that room down the hall where the bed was still made the way Lena had made it. He signed where Drum pointed. He didn't read every line. He had no reason to believe a man who had shaken his hand and sat in his kitchen and called his wife charming would hand him documents designed to gut him. That was what Drum had been banking on. Not greed. Grief. He had waited for Caden to be at his most hollow, and then he had walked through the door. It was Vera Collum, Lena's closest friend in Ashevale, a widow herself who ran the town's only boarding house, who first saw that something was wrong. She came to Caden 2 weeks after Drum's visit, when she'd heard at the land office that 380 acres south of town had been transferred to a holding company called Mesa Creek Properties, which everyone in Ashevale with any sense knew was Drum's shell operation. She showed up at Caden's door and laid it out plainly, because Vera had never once in her life softened a truth that needed to be heard. Caden went very still when she told him. He walked to the cabinet where he kept his documents. He pulled out what Drum had given him to sign. He read it now, for the first time properly. And what it said, under all the legal language, was that Caden Holt had transferred his land, his mineral rights, and his water access to Mesa Creek Properties in exchange for the cancellation of a loan he had never actually taken. His $2,000 deposit had been reclassified in the bank's records as a defaulted loan draw. He owned nothing. He had signed it himself. Caden went to Drum's office the next morning. He was not violent. He was precise and cold and entirely clear about what had been done to him. Drum sat behind his large desk with perfect composure and expressed what sounded like deep regret about the misunderstanding. He offered Caden $100 for relocation expenses. Caden refused it. He said he would go to the county sheriff, the territorial land registry, and if necessary, the federal circuit. Drum listened to all of this, nodded thoughtfully, and then opened his office door. Orrin Feck was standing on the other side of it. Feck and Bones took Caden out through the back and beat him badly enough in the alley behind the bank that he couldn't walk properly for 2 weeks. Then they put him on his horse and pointed it east out of Asheville. "Don't come back," Feck said. "There's nothing for you here." Caden rode east through the dry October fields, past the irrigation channels he had dug with his own hands, past the well behind the schoolhouse, past everything he had built. He didn't look back. He was already planning the day he would return. He just needed time, evidence, and the right judge. 3 years would turn out to be exactly enough. What Caden Holt did in those 3 years was not drifting, though it looked like it from the outside. He moved deliberately. He started in Santa Fe, where he found a territorial land attorney named Ezra Bright, who specialized in disputed deed cases and who, after 2 hours with Caden's documents and a pot of black coffee, agreed to take the case on a contingency arrangement. Bright was 60, compact with a silver mustache and the careful precision of a man who had spent 4 decades making sure every word on paper meant exactly what he intended. He told Caden straight. The case was winnable, but only with a corroborating witness to the document fraud. The deed itself was damning. The forgery of the loan terms was clear to an expert eye. But a frontier judge would want a human confession, not just a paper argument. Drum was well connected. He had donated to judicial campaigns. He had friends in territorial government. Without a witness on the inside, a judge could decide to look the other way. And there was nothing Bright or Caden could do about it. Caden thanked him, put Bright's retainer agreement in the same inside pocket as the original deed, and began thinking about Milo Bassett. Bassett was the man who had sat at that kitchen table and pushed the forged documents across to Caden's grieving hands. He was Drum's accountant, his record keeper, the man whose pen had written the numbers that made the fraud look legitimate on paper. Caden had not forgotten him. He had thought about him during 3 years of cold desert nights and cheap hotel rooms and meals he couldn't always afford. He had thought about the way Bassett never quite met anyone's eyes, the way his hands had moved too quickly when he opened the document case, the way, when Caden signed, Bassett had turned away and looked at the window as if he were trying not to see the thing he was doing. That look had stayed with Caden the way small details do when everything else from a terrible moment goes blurry. It meant something. A man who can't watch his own betrayal is a man who knows it's wrong. And a man who knows it's wrong is a man who might, given enough time and enough weight on his conscience, decide to make it right. Caden sent 2 careful letters to Asheville through trusted hands over those 3 years, asking about Bassett, and what he heard back confirmed his instinct. Bassett was drinking heavily, had lost weight, spoke to almost nobody, and had not left Asheville, which meant the guilt had nowhere to go. In his 2nd year on the road, Caden discovered something that shifted the architecture of his case entirely. He found another town, Reyes Crossing, 40 miles north of Asheville, where Drum had done the same thing. A rancher named Corbett Lund had signed papers during a period of illness and lost 200 acres to Mesa Creek Properties. And in a mining settlement called Colina Roja, a widow named Esperanza Ochoa had lost her late husband's claim in near-identical circumstances. A manufactured debt, a forged transfer, signed during grief. Caden found these people through the network of territory gossip that runs between western towns like water through dry rock. He visited them both. He sat at their tables and heard their stories, and he wrote down everything Bright told him to write down in a journal that lived in the same inside coat pocket as the deed and the retainer agreement. This wasn't just about Caden anymore. This was a pattern. Drum was a predator who targeted the grieving and the sick, the people whose minds had been temporarily hollowed out by loss. He had turned bereavement into a business model. That realization didn't make Caden angrier. It made him colder and more precise. In his third year, a letter from Vera Collum reached him at a post office in Las Cruces. She had heard through a former land office clerk who had left Drum's employ that a federal circuit judge named Harlan Poe would be making a full circuit of New Mexico territory the following spring. Poe was notable in territorial legal circles for two things: an absolute intolerance of fraudulent land transfers, which had become epidemic across the territory, and a complete imperviousness to the social and financial pressure that Drum regularly applied to local officials. He had ruled against 3 of Drum's political allies in separate cases the previous year. He was, Vera wrote in her careful schoolteacher's handwriting, the judge that Caden needed. She also wrote something else at the bottom of the letter. A single sentence that Caden read several times in the dusty Las Cruces post office. Milo Bassett is barely sleeping. He sits alone in the back of the saloon every night and stares at the wall. He looks like a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long. Caden folded the letter into his coat pocket with the other documents and told Ezra Bright in a wire the next morning. It's time. He arrived back in Asheville on a Tuesday in late October, 4 days before Judge Poe was scheduled to ride into town. He came with nothing on his person that Feck and Bones could confiscate. Every document that mattered was in that coat pocket, and that coat never left his body. His legal brief was already filed with Bright in Santa Fe, and a copy had been forwarded to Poe's circuit clerk. The trap was laid. Now the only remaining piece was Milo Bassett, the man whose guilty eyes had haunted Caden through 3 years of planning, and whose testimony could turn every page of paper in that coat pocket from an argument into an undeniable truth. But Caden was not naive. Drum was not stupid. And Bassett, for all his guilt, was still inside Drum's town, inside Drum's reach, under Drum's roof for all practical purposes. Getting to Bassett without Drum finding out was the most delicate move in the entire 3-year game. Which is why, when Caden sat down at that bar and asked Giff for water and studied the mirror, he was not looking at his own reflection. He was looking at the woman with the red fabric roses at her collar, or who was watching him from the far end of the bar, and remembering what Vera Collum looked like before 3 years of carrying her own secrets had put those quiet lines around her eyes. Vera Collum had not changed in the ways that showed on the surface. She was still tall, still direct, still carrying herself with the particular dignity of a woman who had been through enough hard things to stop being afraid of most things. But there was a guardedness to her now that Caden recognized because he had developed the same quality himself. A habit of noting exits, of watching doorways, of registering which people in a room were watching you back. Living in Drum's Asheville for 3 years had taught Vera what Caden had learned on the road, that safety was not something you inherited. It was something you actively maintained. She caught Caden's eye in the bar mirror and gave a small, careful nod, then looked away. She did not approach him then. She waited a full 20 minutes, letting Giff and the card players lose interest in the new stranger and return to their ordinary afternoon. And then she walked past Caden on her way out and let a folded piece of paper fall from her sleeve onto the bar beside his hat. Caden palmed it without looking down. He finished his water, left a coin on the counter, and walked out into the late afternoon street. The paper said, "Boarding house. Come after dark. Use the back door by the wood pile. Tell nobody. V." He came after dark, as instructed, moving through the alleys behind the main street where the light didn't reach, and the only sound was his boots in the dirt, and somewhere north of town, a coyote calling at the quarter moon. Vera's boarding house was a 2-story wooden building on the east side of Asheville, with a porch that needed painting and a garden that was the tidiest square of earth in the entire town. Her one visible act of defiance against the drab decline Drum had spread through Asheville like a slow stain. The back door was unlocked. He came in through the woodpile alley and found her in the kitchen with coffee already made, a lantern turned low on the table, and her hands folded in front of her with the composed tension of someone who had spent the day pretending everything was ordinary. She looked at him for a long moment before she said anything. "You look terrible," she said. "You look like exactly what you are." It wasn't a compliment and wasn't an insult. Just Vera being precise. He sat down. She poured the coffee. And then she told him what 3 years in Drum's Asheville looked like from the inside. The town had changed, and not for the better. Drum owned the mercantile, the bank, the hotel, and now the feed store. He had bought out 3 farming families south of town, whose land abutted Caden's former acres, in each case through manufactured debt or inflated fees that the families couldn't dispute or afford to contest. He employed Feck and 2 other men as a private enforcement operation that functioned as Asheville's de facto law, the actual sheriff having left 2 years ago and not been replaced, because replacing him was a county decision, and Drum controlled the county commissioner. The school was still running. Vera had made sure of that, teaching 2 days a week herself because the formal teacher Drum had brought in was more interested in curriculum that praised the town's wealthy benefactor than in actually educating children. The church had a pastor again, a thin, frightened man named Lyle, who said nothing from the pulpit that Drum wouldn't approve of. The town had stopped being a community and had become something else. An operation. Asheville existed now to generate revenue for Silas Drum, and most of its residents had accepted this the way people accept weather, with resentment, with weariness, and with a complete absence of belief that it could change. "They need to see that it can change," Vera said, looking directly at Caden across the kitchen table. "They need to see someone make it change." Caden asked about Milo Bassett. Vera's expression shifted into something more careful. Bassett was still in town, still on Drum's payroll as accountant, still living in a rented room above the general store. He was 42 years old and looked 60. He drank every night at the saloon, always alone, always in the same corner table at the back near the storeroom door. He had not, as far as Vera could tell, spoken to Drum in any context beyond strictly required professional exchange in over a year. He attended church irregularly, and when he did, he sat near the back and stared at the floor during the sermon. 2 months ago, she said, she had been passing the saloon late at night and heard Bassett alone at his corner table with no one else in the room, saying something to his drink in a low, broken voice. She had stopped and listened. He said, "I shouldn't have signed it. I shouldn't have signed it." Over and over. She had kept moving, but she hadn't forgotten it. She was telling Caden now because Bassett's guilt was real, and real guilt was the only currency that could buy what Caden needed. "He's close to breaking," she said. "He just needs someone to crack the door for him." Caden nodded slowly. He set his coffee cup down. "Tomorrow night," he said. introduced me to his corner. He had barely finished the sentence when the sound came. Boots on the wooden steps of the back porch, slow and deliberate, the way someone walks when they want you to hear them coming. Vera was on her feet before the knock came at the door, reaching for the lantern to turn it down. But the knock didn't come. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. And then, after a silence of maybe 4 seconds that felt like 4 minutes, they moved away again, back down the steps, back into the dark. Vera and Caden stood in the almost dark kitchen and listened to them go. When the sound had faded completely, Vera let her breath out very slowly. "Feck," she said quietly. Not a question. She had heard that walk before. Caden moved to the window and looked out at the alley, but there was nothing visible, just the dark and the quarter moon hanging thin above the roofline. He had been in town for less than 6 hours, and Drum already knew he'd made contact with Vera. He had expected this. It meant he had less time than he had hoped. He looked at Vera across the dark kitchen. "I need to see Bassett tonight," he said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." Vera looked at the door, then back at Caden, then reached for her shawl. "I know where he'll be," she said. They found Milo Bassett exactly where Vera said he'd be, at his corner table in the back of the Dusty Forks saloon, a half-empty whiskey glass in front of him and a candle in a tin holder throwing a small, yellowed light across his face. The saloon was nearly empty at that hour. Giff was cleaning up at the bar, and a sleeping cowhand in a far corner contributed nothing but snoring. Caden walked in through the side door Vera indicated and crossed directly to Bassett's table and sat down across from him without invitation. Bassett looked up. His eyes, behind the spectacles he still wore, were bloodshot and watery and full of the particular misery that comes not from circumstances, but from knowledge. From knowing exactly what you did and not being able to stop knowing it. He looked at Caden for 3 full seconds, and then something in his face did a complicated thing. It wasn't surprise. It was closer to what a man looks like when a knock finally comes at the door he has been dreading for years. Terrible relief mixed with pure terror. He said nothing. Caden said nothing. Caden simply placed his hand flat on the table and looked at Bassett and waited, the way a man waits when he has all the time in the world and the other person has run entirely out of it. "I know who you are," Bassett said finally. His voice was barely above a whisper. Giff was still moving behind the bar, clattering glasses, and the sleeping cowhand hadn't shifted. Caden said, "I know that you know." Bassett's hands moved on the table, picking up his glass, setting it down without drinking from it, picking it up again. His knuckles had gone white. "He told me it was legal," Bassett said. "He told me the man had genuinely taken the loan, and the deed transfer was the agreed settlement. He gave me documents that showed a loan agreement." He paused. I should have looked at those documents harder. I knew what kind of man Drum was by then. I knew. But I had debts of my own, and he'd paid them off, and I thought I could just be someone who kept his head down and did his job and let things happen around him without being the cause. He stopped, looked at the glass. "That is not how it works," he said, with a blankness that told Caden this was not a new conclusion. This was something Milo Bassett had understood for 3 years, in the way that a nail understands the hammer, completely, through repeated direct experience, and without any capacity to change what had already happened. Caden did not comfort him. He did not tell him it was all right or that he understood, because none of that was what Bassett needed, and none of it would have been entirely true. What he said was this: "I have a land deed with an original survey date. I have bank records showing my $2,000 deposit predating the supposed loan by 6 months. I have a land attorney in Santa Fe with a legal brief already filed. And I have 2 other families in Reyes Crossing and Colina Roja who Drum did the same thing to. He laid this out quietly and carefully, like a man setting tools on a workbench. Judge Harlan Poe rides into Asheville in 4 days. He will hold circuit court at the saloon, because that is the only room in this town large enough. He paused. I need one person who was in that room when those papers were signed to tell the truth about what those papers actually were. The silence between them stretched long enough that the candle in the tin holder sputtered, almost went out, and then steadied. Bassett's jaw worked. His eyes were wet behind the spectacles. If I do that, he said slowly, Drum will destroy me. Caden looked at him steadily. He already is, he said. Look at yourself. What happened next was not a dramatic moment. There was no thunderclap, no sudden transformation. Bassett simply put his face in his hands and sat like that for about a minute, while the candle burned and Giff rattled bottles at the other end of the room. When he lifted his face, his eyes were red and wet, and his expression was different from before. Not resolved exactly, but emptied of something. Like a man who has put down a weight he's been carrying so long, he'd forgotten it wasn't part of his body. What do you need from me? He said. Caden told him, a signed written statement before any court proceeding, detailing the forged documentation, the manufactured loan terms, and the pressure Drum had used to secure Bassett's participation. Notarized where possible, delivered to Vera before the judge arrived, and if possible, in person, in court. Bassett nodded slowly. His hands had stopped shaking. He reached into his coat, and Caden's hand moved instinctively. But Bassett only produced a small notebook and a pencil. I keep notes, he said. Everything. Because I knew somewhere that someday I'd have to account for it. He put the notebook on the table. I've been keeping it for 3 years. They did not see the kitchen girl in the doorway. She was 17, a quiet girl named Prue, who worked the late wash-up at the saloon, and who had worked for Drum since she was 14, and who had, without anyone asking her about it, developed the habit of listening for things that might be worth reporting to Deputy Feck in exchange for the small consideration that made the difference in her family's rent. She had come to collect the dirty glasses from the back section and had heard enough. She didn't come all the way into the room. She backed up silently into the kitchen hallway and was gone before either man at the table looked up. Caden walked back to Vera's at midnight with Bassett's promise and the knowledge that his window had just gotten shorter. Drum would hear something had happened in that corner of the saloon. He might not know the specifics yet. Prue had come in late and might have caught only pieces. But pieces were enough for a man like Drum, who understood leverage and threat the way other men understood sunlight. Instinctively, completely, and as an essential condition of how the world worked. Caden lay on the cot in Vera's back room and stared at the ceiling and listened to the quiet town and thought, 4 days. It has to be 4 days. The summons came the next morning, delivered by Bones at Vera's front door. A folded note in Drum's handwriting on Drum's first saving stationery, requesting the pleasure of Mr. Holt's company at 11 o'clock. Vera handed it to Caden with one raised eyebrow. Caden folded it and put it in his coat pocket with the deed and the retainer and Vera's letter, which was getting company in there. He told Vera to keep her doors locked until he came back. He arrived at Drum's office at 11 o'clock precisely and was shown in by Drum's private secretary, a quiet man who looked at the floor when Caden passed him, as most people in Drum's orbit had learned to do. Drum's office was large and well appointed by frontier standards. A mahogany desk, territorial maps framed behind glass on the walls, a silver coffee service on the sideboard. Drum himself stood by the window, looking out at Ashvale's main street, which was his posture for receiving people he considered subordinate. He waited a beat after Caden came in, just long enough to signal that time in this room belonged to Drum. And then he turned and smiled and said, "Mr. Holt, please sit down." Caden sat. Drum sat. Coffee was poured, and Caden did not touch his cup, which Drum noted. They looked at each other across the big desk like two men playing a game both have studied for a very long time, and neither willing to let the other see how much was riding on the next few moves. Drum began by saying he'd heard Caden had come back to Ashvale, and that he quite understood it. A man had attachments to the place where he'd done his finest work, and Caden's irrigation system was a genuine engineering achievement that anyone would be proud to have built. He said this warmly and specifically, citing the dimensions of the South Channel and the output capacity of the Hillspring diversion, which told Caden that Drum had studied the work carefully and was using familiarity as a weapon. Then he said he was also aware that Caden had some concerns about the circumstances of the land transfer in 1879, and that he was genuinely troubled that there may have been some confusion in how the documentation had been handled during what was, obviously, an extraordinarily difficult period for Caden personally. He said the word confused 4 times in 3 sentences. He had the careful, sympathetic delivery of a man who had practiced neutralizing accusations by absorbing them into the language of misunderstanding. Then he named a number. $500 in cash for Caden to sign a release of any and all claims against Drum's First Savings Bank or Mesa Creek properties, and to leave Ashvale before Judge Poe's circuit. Caden looked at him. "The land is worth $8,000 at current territory rates," he said. "My deposit with 3 years of standard interest is $2,400. You owe me damages from the assault in the alley behind this building, which are in fact conducted under your direction." He paused. $500 is not a serious offer. Drum's warm expression didn't change. He upped the figure to $1,200. Caden stood up, put his hat on, and said, "When Judge Poe finishes his circuit in this town, you will pay me everything you owe. Not what you decide is convenient. Everything." He turned toward the door. Drum's voice came from behind him, no longer warm, no longer speaking in the language of misunderstanding. "You have no standing witness," Drum said. "You have paper. Clever paper, maybe. But paper doesn't speak." Caden opened the door. "No," he said without turning around. "But Milo Bassett does." The silence from behind the big desk was complete. Caden walked through it and down the hallway and out into the street. He did not look back. But he had said the name deliberately, because he needed Drum's attention focused on the option of pressuring Bassett rather than on any other variable Caden hadn't fully controlled. Let Drum go to Bassett with threats. Bassett had already written his statement and given it to Vera the previous night, sealed in an envelope addressed to attorney Ezra Bright. Vera had it sewn inside the lining of her winter coat. Drum could pressure Bassett all he liked. The statement was already gone. But Caden had miscalculated one element of the equation. Or rather, he had correctly calculated it, but underestimated the speed with which Drum would act. He was halfway back to Vera's, walking through the side street that cut behind the livery, when the sound of boots came, fast and heavy from 2 directions at once. He turned. Feck was in front of him. Bones was behind. There was a third man he didn't recognize, younger, with a scar along his jaw. All 3 were moving quickly. Caden had exactly 2 seconds to decide between running and standing still. He stood still. It was the wrong decision, but it was the honest one. They hit him before he could say anything. He woke up in the dirt of the alley with his coat still on. They had looked for documents and found only the physical deed, which Feck pocketed, and his left eye swollen shut and 2 ribs sending signals he didn't want to think about. He lay still for a moment and took stock. He was alive. His coat was still on. The deed was gone, but Bright had the filing copies. His jaw hurt in a way that would make eating difficult for a week. His hands, which had covered his face by instinct, were scraped and 1 knuckle was split. In the inside pocket of his coat, behind the stitched interior, lining where no quick hand search would find them, the retainer document and Vera's letter and the notarized copy of his deposit record and the letter from the Santa Fe Land Registry, all of it was still there. He had hidden those particular documents in the lining the morning he rode into Asheville. He had anticipated exactly this. His original physical deed was gone, but it was also the one piece of evidence Drum already knew existed and had already forged around. Losing it changed nothing. He got up slowly, steadied himself against the alley wall, and began the long walk to Vera's back door. 3 days left until Poe arrived. He'd been hit worse. He just needed to be standing when the judge walked through the door. Vera did not say anything dramatic when she opened her back door and found Caden standing there, with his left eye swollen shut and his breathing careful and shallow on the left side. She had seen men beaten before. She also had the particular composure of someone who had expected something like this and had already prepared for it. She brought him in, sat him down at the kitchen table, lit the lamp, and went to work with clean water and cotton and liniment with the efficient gentleness of a woman who had nursed her late husband through 2 bad winters and a horse accident. Caden sat still under her hands and reported the facts of what had happened in sequence, without embellishment. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, and when she had finished with the cut above his eye and the wrap of cloth around his midsection to support the ribs, she sat down across from him and said, "They took the deed." "They took the deed," he confirmed. She thought about this. "You have copies. Bright has everything." She nodded slowly, with the expression of someone recalculating. Then she reached into the inside of her winter coat, which was hanging on the peg by the door, and removed a sealed envelope and set it on the table. "Bassett's statement," she said. "Signed and witnessed by the Methodist minister, who owes Drum nothing because he arrived 3 weeks ago and doesn't know enough yet to be afraid." Caden picked up the envelope and turned it over in his hands. It was heavier than he expected. He opened it carefully, with Vera's letter opener. Inside was not 1 page, but 11, in Bassett's small, precise accountant's script, detailing every transaction that had been falsified, every document that had been altered, every client of Drum's who had been similarly defrauded across the territory, and a specific, sequential account of the night. Drum had instructed him to prepare the forged transfer deed for Caden's land. It was meticulous. It was the work of a man who had been composing a confession in his head for 3 years and had finally found the page. At the bottom of the last page, below Bassett's signature, was the minister's certification stamp, the date, and a single, handwritten line in a different hand. "I am prepared to read this statement aloud in court if required. Milo Bassett." Caden read it twice, slowly, in Vera's lamplit kitchen, while his ribs ached and his eye throbbed. Then he folded it back into the envelope and put it in the inside coat pocket with everything else. "He came through," Vera said. Caden looked up. "He came through," he agreed. There was more emotion in those 3 words, from both of them, than either would acknowledge. The next morning, Drum went to Bassett. Caden was not there to hear it, but Vera's neighbor Cass, who rented storage above the general store, heard raised voices from Bassett's room. He reported to Vera that Drum's voice, cold and flat in a way it rarely was in public, told Bassett that he knew what happened to people who misremembered things in this town. He heard Bassett say, very quietly, that he no longer had anything to misremember because he had already put the truth in writing, and that writing was no longer in his possession. A long silence. Then Drum's boots on the stairs, hard and fast, going down. Vera brought this to Caden at midday. He nodded. Drum now knew the statement existed and was beyond his reach. His only remaining option was to delay the circuit or discredit Caden before the case was heard. He had connections in territorial administration. 2 days left. Everything depended on whether Poe was as incorruptible as his reputation, and whether political pressure could be mobilized fast enough to matter. Caden sent a wire to Ezra Bright. "Come immediately. Bring everything." The reply came back within an hour, already riding. That evening, Caden did something nobody expected. He got up off the cot in Vera's back room, put on his coat, walked to the saloon, and sat down at the bar. He was visibly beaten. His eye was deep purple-green. He moved with the careful economy of a man whose ribs were registering every breath. Giff looked at him, and then deliberately didn't look at him, in the way of barmen everywhere. The townspeople in the saloon, a farmer, 2 ranch hands, an older woman from the mercantile, all glanced at him and looked away. But Caden didn't flinch. He sat at that bar with his water and his damaged face and his straight posture. And he let the room feel the weight of what Drum's men had done. He didn't perform anything. He made no speeches. He simply existed in that space, plainly and completely, until the room could not ignore him. 2 people left, but one stayed. Aldous Creed, the farmer who'd lost his south field to Mesa Creek 18 months ago. He moved down the bar and sat beside Caden and said, very quietly, without looking at him, "You're not the only one he did this to." Caden met his eyes in the mirror. "I know," he said, "and Poe will hear about all of it." Judge Harlan Poe rode into Asheville the following morning on a tall black horse, accompanied by a federal marshal named DeVoe, a circuit clerk, and Ezra Bright, who had ridden through the night to join the party 10 miles east of town. Poe was 60 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a white beard and small wire-rimmed glasses perched on a broad nose, and he wore a plain dark coat with no ornamentation of any kind. He did not look like power. He looked like a man who did not need to look like power, which is a specific and formidable kind of authority. He rode past the Drum's First Savings sign, and the Drum's Mercantile sign, and the Drum's Hotel without any visible reaction, though his circuit clerk, a young man named Thomas, noticed that the judge's eyes moved across each sign and registered it with the quiet, precise attention of a man who knows what he is looking at and has already begun to form an opinion. Drum met Poe on the street, in his best suit with his warmest handshake and his most civic-minded expression. Poe shook his hand, said Mr. Drum in a flat, neutral voice, and then said he would need the saloon cleared and prepared for court proceedings beginning at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. "We have some matters to address," Poe said. He didn't smile. In Caden's coat pocket, 11 pages of Milo Bassett's handwriting waited for their moment. Tomorrow. Finally, tomorrow. The morning of the hearing, Asheville woke up with a particular quality of silence, the kind that settles over a town when something large is about to happen and everyone can feel it coming, but nobody wants to be the first to say so. By 8 o'clock, people were drifting toward the Dusty Fork Saloon without quite committing to going inside, standing in the street outside with the excuse of other business, while clearly having no other business at all. The saloon had been reconfigured the night before by Poe's clerk. Tables pushed back, a long table set at the far end where the judge would sit. Chairs arranged in rough rows for observers, and a stove burning. In the corner, because the morning was cold enough that your breath came out white, Caden arrived at 8:45 with Ezra Bright at his side, a controlled, compact figure in a dark suit who moved like a man accustomed to rooms where a wrong word will cost more than money. Vera was already inside, sitting straight-backed in the second row. Aldous Creed was there. 3 other farmers whose land had been absorbed by Mesa Creek in the past 2 years were there. Milo Bassett was there, sitting in the back corner with his hands clasped between his knees, his face the color of old ash, but present and sober, which meant more than it might have meant for anyone else. Drum arrived at 9 o'clock with his own attorney, a man named Webb, who had ridden up from Las Cruces and who wore his confidence like his cufflinks, conspicuously and as a signal. Webb was competent and well-dressed and immediately began filing a preliminary motion with Poe's clerk arguing jurisdictional deficiency, that the case had no standing in the circuit court because no formal complaint had been lodged through the county sheriff's office. It was a procedural attempt to close the door before the room had a chance to hear anything. Poe listened to this motion for approximately 45 seconds before he said, with no particular emphasis, "Denied." In territories where the county sheriff position has been effectively vacated and the function of law enforcement has been assumed by private interest, this circuit court has full original jurisdiction. Mr. Bright, you may proceed. Webb opened his mouth. Poe looked at him over his wire-rimmed glasses with an expression of absolute patience and complete inflexibility, the way a mountain looks at weather. Webb closed his mouth. In the third row, someone made a quiet sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a gasp. The hearing had been underway for 4 minutes, and Drum's first move was already gone. Bright was methodical and precise in the way that Caden had come to deeply appreciate over 3 years of partnership. He presented the original survey documentation in Caden's name, dated 1877. He presented the land registry correspondence from Santa Fe confirming no legal loan agreement existed in the territorial records at the time of the alleged transfer. He presented the bank deposit receipt showing Caden's $2,000 deposit in March 1879, and the subsequent bank record showing that deposit classified as a loan draw with no corresponding loan agreement, no promissory note, and no collateral documentation. He presented Poe with comparable evidence from the Reyes Crossing and Colina Roja cases. He laid it all out in a flat, unsparing sequence that built upon itself the way a properly engineered channel builds momentum. Slowly, then inevitably. Webb objected 4 times. Poe sustained none of the objections. Then Bright said, "Your Honor, we have a witness statement." He produced Bassett's 11-page document. Additionally, Bright said, "The author of that statement is present and available to speak directly." Drum had been sitting beside Webb with the posture of a man who expected the walls to hold. But when Bright said Bassett's name, and when every head in the room turned toward the back corner where Bassett sat, something shifted in Drum's face for the first time. It wasn't fear precisely. It was the expression of a man recalculating odds and finding that a number he had believed was reliably small had become very, very large. Webb leaned close to Drum and whispered something. Drum shook his head fractionally. Webb stood and objected to Bassett's testimony on grounds of conflict of interest. Bassett was an employee of the defendant and therefore a compromised witness. Poe looked at Webb. "Mr. Bassett," he said, addressing the back corner directly, "are you currently employed by Mr. Silas Drum?" Bassett stood up. His voice was rough but audible. "I am tendering my resignation as of this morning, Your Honor." A sound moved through the room. Drum's hands, flat on the table in front of him, pressed down slowly. Bassett walked to the front of the room and sat in the chair beside Bright's table and looked at Poe with the face of a man who has decided that whatever comes next is better than what came before. He spoke for 22 minutes without pause. Then Drum stood up. He didn't wait for Webb to advise him. He stood up and said that Bassett was a drunk and a disgruntled employee manufacturing a story to settle personal grievances, and that every document Bright had presented was subject to authentication questions that Webb would outline shortly. His voice was controlled and firm and carried the practiced authority of a man who had used his voice to determine outcomes for 20 years in this town. But this was not this town. This was Harlan Poe's courtroom, which existed by federal commission and not by social arrangement or local intimidation. Poe listened to Drum without interrupting, and when Drum finished, Poe said very quietly, "Mr. Drum, please sit down." Drum sat. Poe asked the Marshal DeVoe to position himself at the door. Then Poe looked at his clerk, who had been taking notes throughout the entire proceeding in quick, efficient shorthand. He looked at the documents laid on the table before him. He picked up Bassett's statement and read 3 pages of it in complete silence while the room waited. Then he set it down and took off his glasses and looked at Silas Drum across the room. "In 32 years on this circuit," Poe said, "I have rarely encountered a case where the evidence of deliberate fraud was this comprehensively documented." He paused. Marshal DeVoe. Drum was on his feet and moving toward the back door before DeVoe reached him. DeVoe caught Drum 3 steps from the back door of the saloon. Not dramatically, not with any struggle, simply by stepping into his path and saying, "Sir," in a tone that was a wall. Drum stopped. He looked at the marshal, at the room behind him, at the door in front of him, that was suddenly not an exit, but just a piece of wood. His attorney, Webb, had his face in his hands at the defense table. Milo Bassett sat very still in his chair, with his eyes closed and his hands unclasped in his lap, for the first time in what looked like years. Drum turned around slowly, with the deliberate composure of a man who understood that his final audience was everyone in this room, and that how he turned around in this moment would constitute the last public image he could control. He straightened his coat. He walked back to his chair and sat down. Whatever you thought of Silas Drum, he did that with something approaching dignity, and it was the last dignified thing he did in Asheville for a very long time. The room was completely quiet. Outside, through the saloon's front windows, a small crowd had gathered on the boardwalk, faces pressed close to the glass to see, and the news was already moving through Asheville with the speed that important news always moves in small towns. Person to person, spoken in low voices, spreading outward from the saloon like water from a cracked vessel. Poe's ruling came 40 minutes later, after a brief adjournment during which he reviewed documents with his clerk and conferred with DeVoe. It was comprehensive. The deed transfer of Caden Holt's 380 acres to Mesa Creek Properties was voided on the grounds of fraud and undue influence executed during a period of documented incapacity. The $2,000 deposit plus 3 years of standard compound interest, $2,411, was to be repaid immediately from Drum's first savings accounts, which DeVoe was authorized to freeze pending compliance. Drum faced criminal charges for fraud to be heard at the territorial court in Santa Fe. where the Reyes Crossing and Colina Roja cases would also be consolidated. Two of the other farmers in the room who had lost land to Mesa Creek in the past 2 years were instructed to file formal claims with Bright's office within 30 days. Oren Feck, present as a witness and named explicitly in Bassett's statement as having committed assault under Drum's direction, was stripped of his deputy credentials by order of the circuit court. The badge came off his chest in front of the entire town. He surrendered it without resistance, staring at the floor, because there was nothing left to do. Caden, sitting in the front row, watched without expression. What happened after the gavel came down was not the eruption of triumphant noise that stories sometimes imagine. It was quieter and more complicated than that. People filed out of the saloon into the October street and stood about in small groups, speaking in the lowered voices of a community in the process of remembering something it had forgotten, namely, that Asheville had existed before Silas Drum arrived and could exist after he left. Aldous Creed shook Caden's hand and then didn't let go of it for several seconds, as if the handshake were doing double work that words couldn't manage. Milo Bassett walked out of the saloon into the pale morning light and stood on the boardwalk and breathed deeply, the way a man breathes when he has put something down that he thought was permanent. He didn't speak to Caden. He didn't need to. The minister who had notarized the statement put a hand briefly on Bassett's shoulder, and then both of them went their separate ways in the direction of the church. Vera stood outside the saloon door with her arms folded and her eyes bright and said nothing to anyone for a while, which was unusual enough that the people around her gave her space, understanding without being told that she was doing something privately necessary. She was thinking about Lena, who deserved to have seen this. Caden sat with Bright at a corner table inside the now quiet saloon and worked through the practical details for 2 hours. His land was legally restored. His money, with interest, would come from Drum's accounts within 30 days under Devo's oversight. The damages from the assault were added to the claim. Drum's criminal case would move to Santa Fe. Caden would need to appear once to give testimony, which Bright would arrange. All of this was real and documented and enforceable and everything that 3 years of planning had been aimed at. But somewhere in the middle of this table talk, Caden found himself thinking about what he actually intended to do with 380 acres of New Mexico land. He had no livestock. He had no farming equipment. He was alone, and the house on that land had been neglected for 3 years and would need work. He looked at Bright and said slowly, as if the idea were forming as he spoke it, "The irrigation channels on that land. They don't just water my fields. They water 6 other farms south of town." Bright nodded. He could see where this was going and had the intelligence to let it go there without redirecting. "If I fence it off, those farms lose their water access," Caden said. He was quiet for a moment. Lena would have had something to say about that. He left Asheville 3 days later, on a Thursday morning when the frost was still white on the grass and the sky had gone the particular clean blue that follows New Mexico's first hard cold. Before he rode out, he signed 2 documents Bright had drawn up. The first placed his water rights and irrigation channels into a public land trust, managed by Vera Collum, Aldous Creed, and 4 other farming families who had worked that land for decades. The property stayed recorded in his name, but it would belong, in every way that mattered, to the people who depended on it. The second document recorded a symbolic payment of $1 from each of the 19 families who had used his water channels for 7 years. He collected 19 coins and put them in the coat pocket where the deed used to be. He said goodbye to Vera at her kitchen door. She looked at him completely, the way only she ever had. "Will you come back?" she asked. He put his hat on and looked through her window at the well behind the schoolhouse, the one he'd built before anyone in Asheville believed the rest was possible. "Maybe," he said. He rode west down the main street. The people of Ashevale came to their boardwalks and watched him go, not with suspicion, not with the hollow indifference of a town under occupation, but with something that lived in the chest and stayed there. He rode past the schoolhouse, past the channels, past everything he had built. He didn't look back. He had ridden into Ashevale with nothing. He rode out whole,